What happens when peace finally arrives, and it feels like it belongs to someone else? It doesn't arrive with intense discomfort. It doesn't arrive with obvious anxiety. It simply arrives, and it doesn't fit. As if you've walked into a room that isn't yours. The room is nice, maybe even beautiful, but while you're in it, there's a persistent feeling that something is off, that you don't really belong there, that the people who belong in that room are a different kind of person, with different stories, with different nervous systems, and that feeling of peace as foreign territory is different from what this channel has already explored about the difficulty of resting. The discomfort with calm is real, and we've already explored it here in depth. A nervous system calibrated for vigilance interprets a drop in activation as something unusual. Stillness itself sets off the alarm. But what this video explores goes deeper than a temporary state. It's about identity, not peace makes me uncomfortable, but peace isn't meant for someone like me. People like me don't stay at peace for very long. When I feel at peace, something must be wrong, because peace isn't my natural state. Have you ever had that thought? Not as an analysis, as a quiet certainty. Psychologist William Swan from the University of Texas spent decades investigating something that seems paradoxical at first glance. Why do people accept, and sometimes even actively seek out, negative information about themselves? The answer he reached through decades of research became known as self-verification theory. According to Swan, people don't seek only positive information about themselves. Above all, they seek information that confirms what they already believe themselves to be. Information that is consistent with their existing self-concept, even when that self-concept is unfavorable. The underlying logic is this. Your self-concept is the foundation on which your decisions, predictions, and interpretations of the world are built. If that self-concept changes in an uncontrolled way, if incompatible information enters without being integrated, the system loses one of its most fundamental anchors, its internal coherence, its sense that there is a stable, consistent version of who you are. And for the psychological system, losing that coherence feels more threatening than maintaining a painful self-concept. Think about what that means in practice. A person whose self-concept includes, I'm someone who struggles, who manages crises, who never has an easy life, constantly receives information that the system interprets through that internal map. When a crisis appears, the system says, this fits who I am. When a difficulty shows up, the system says, as expected. When something goes wrong, there's a strange sense of recognition, not pleasant, but familiar. When peace arrives, when things are genuinely stable, when there is no crisis, when life offers what most people would call tranquility, the system doesn't say, finally. It says something closer to, this doesn't fit who I am. Not deliberately, not by choice, but as the response of a system that treats internal consistency as a priority and experiences peace as information that conflicts with the self-concept holding that consistency together. Swan documented something especially revealing for understanding this pattern. People with a negative self-concept don't just passively process positive information with skepticism. They actively seek environments, relationships, and situations that confirm the self-concept they already have. And when they find themselves in situations that contradict that self-concept, such as periods of stability and peace, they often feel out of place. Not because stability is bad, but because it doesn't confirm who the system believes it is. Because belonging in a peaceful state would require, at some level, revising part of the self-concept that has served as the reference point for so long that it simply feels like the truth. But where does a self-concept organized around struggle come from? How does identity reach a point where turbulence feels more authentic than tranquility? The answer begins with something psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi documented about the moments when people feel most fully alive and most completely themselves. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who spent decades researching at the University of Chicago and later at Claremont Graduate University, became widely known for documenting a psychological state he called flow. Flow is the state of complete engagement in a challenging activity, When the task sits precisely at the edge of your abilities, neither so easy that it becomes boring nor so difficult that it becomes overwhelming. In that state, self-consciousness fades. Time feels different. And there is a feeling that many people describe as being more fully alive than at any other moment. What Csikszentmihalyi discovered about flow is relevant to this video in a way that is rarely discussed. Flow emerges in challenge, not in ease, not in static peace. It appears at the point of greatest demand that still remains within your reach. And for many people, especially those who grew up in environments that required constant adaptation, demanded performance under pressure, or rewarded the ability to function well even under difficult conditions, the moments when they felt most alive, most coherent, and most unmistakably themselves happened during periods of challenge. The mind that solved the urgent problem at 3 in the morning. The body that somehow found the energy to face a crisis when it seemed there was nothing left. The person who navigated an incredibly difficult situation and came out the other side intact. In those moments, the system knew who it was. It knew exactly what it needed to do. It knew, in a way that is difficult to explain but instantly recognizable, that it was being completely itself. And when peace finally arrives, when there is no crisis, no urgency, no challenge demanding the system's highest performing version, what can emerge is not relief, but a subtle feeling of becoming smaller, of being less, of existing with less definition. Not because peace is objectively worse than crisis, but because the system has learned to associate its clearest sense of self with a state of active challenge. And within that internal map, peace becomes associated with something vague, shapeless, lacking the clarity of knowing who you are and what you're meant to be doing. Think about how precisely this pattern fits certain experiences. The person who, for years, was the one who held everything together in a struggling family, who knew exactly who they were whenever there was a problem to solve. The mother, the son, the sister, the partner, the one who keeps functioning when everything falls apart. When that chapter ends, when the family becomes stable and the role of crisis manager is no longer needed, a kind of disorientation can appear that has no easy name. Why do I feel so strange now that everything is okay? Or the professional who spent years working under relentless pressure, startups, crisis projects, environments that demanded constant performance. When life finally becomes more stable, instead of genuine relief, they experience a vague sense of restlessness. It feels like I'm wasting my potential. It feels like I'm not being who I'm supposed to be. Or the person who left a difficult relationship, intense, unpredictable, full of dramatic highs and lows, who is now in a relationship that is stable, peaceful, and free from constant conflict. And yet, strangely, something feels missing. Not because the unhealthy relationship was better, but because intensity was familiar, and familiarity became confused with belonging. In every one of these situations, the system is not seeking suffering. It is seeking the state in which it learned to recognize itself. And over enough time, that state became the state of challenge. Csikszentmihalyi showed that flow, that feeling of being completely yourself, can emerge in many different contexts. That stability and peace can generate their own form of complete engagement, their own form of full presence. But for that to happen, the system has to learn that peace is also a legitimate place for the self to exist fully. A place where who you are is not diminished, but simply expressed in a different way. And learning that is not simple when years of experience have linked the clearest experience of the self with challenge. If this describes something you've experienced, that particular feeling of being more fully yourself in difficulty than in calm, this channel exists to put a name to exactly that pattern. Subscribe so the next videos will already be waiting for you, but there is still another layer that connects self-concept to the way the stories we tell about ourselves determine what we believe belongs to us and what we believe belongs to other people. A layer that explains why, for some people, peace doesn't simply feel unfamiliar. It feels like it belongs to a different story, someone else's life, not their own. Michael White, the therapist and researcher who co-founded narrative therapy, spent decades developing a model of identity that differs radically from most traditional psychological approaches. For White, identity is not a fixed structure that exists inside a person. It is a story, a collection of narratives about who you are, how you got here, and what your experiences mean, that the mind consistently selects, emphasizes, and tells itself over time. What he called the dominant story is the narrative that occupies the foreground, the one with the greatest number of supporting examples available in memory, the one the mind uses to make sense of what happens. And what White documented is that dominant stories have one crucial characteristic. They filter experience. Events that confirm the dominant story are remembered, amplified, and integrated. Events that contradict it are dismissed, minimized, or simply not recognized as meaningful. For someone whose dominant story is, "I'm someone who has to struggle," or, in more specific forms, "My life has always been harder than most people's," or, "I'm not the kind of person who gets to experience real peace." Moments of genuine peace are processed in a very particular way. They are not integrated as evidence that the story might be changing. They are dismissed as exceptions, as coincidences, as something that won't last because it doesn't fit the main narrative. It's good right now, but it won't stay this way. This isn't really meant for someone like me. I'm just waiting for the difficult part. Each of those thoughts is the dominant story processing peace as incompatible information and finding a way to keep it outside the narrative without requiring the system to reconsider who it believes it is. Henry Teifel and John Turner, the British psychologists who developed social identity theory, arrived at the same phenomenon from a different perspective. Their central argument is that a significant part of who we believe we are is constructed through identification with certain groups, and, just as importantly, through contrast with groups we do not see ourselves as belonging to. "I'm the kind of person who handles hardship" quietly implies a comparison. Unlike people whose lives are easier, unlike people who can rest without guilt, unlike people for whom peace feels natural. This identity built through contrast is powerful because it works in two directions at once. It defines who you are, and it defines who you are not. So when peace genuinely arrives, when the system finds itself in a state that, according to its own narrative, belonged to the other group, something deeper than discomfort can emerge, a more fundamental disorientation. If I'm at peace now, what kind of person does that make me? If I can truly rest, what does that say about who I was when I couldn't? Questions like these rarely appear in such explicit words. They arrive as a vague sense of unfamiliarity, as though you're playing a role you never rehearsed, as though peace is a suit tailored for someone else. It fits, but somehow it doesn't feel like yours. Think about how this dynamic appears in very specific situations. Someone who, after years of financial hardship, finally reaches stability. Instead of feeling the relief they expected, they experience an uneasy feeling whenever they spend money without guilt. A sense that abundance isn't meant for someone like them, that they're making some kind of mistake that will eventually be exposed. Or the student who spent their entire life equating their worth with constant effort, and who, during their first period of genuine free time, feels an emptiness they can't explain, as though rest itself were a betrayal of who they've always been. Or the person who endured a deeply painful relationship and now finds themselves in a calm, stable one. Yet stability somehow feels like too much. They don't know how to exist when there's no tension to manage, as though love without drama belongs to a version of life that was never written into their story. In every one of these examples, what is happening is not conscious self-sabotage. It is the system remaining loyal to the story it has learned to tell about itself. A story in which peace, ease, and genuine stability belong to other people's lives. A story in which stepping into that territory somehow feels dishonest, or at the very least, like being cast in the wrong role. But White documented something fundamental about dominant stories. They are dominant, but they are never the only stories. Alongside every story of struggle and hardship, there are always moments that don't fit. Times when peace was real. Periods of genuine calm, even if they were brief. experiences of ease that the system never integrated into its identity because they didn't match the existing narrative. He called these alternative stories. And the transformation of an identity organized around struggle does not happen by abandoning the dominant story. It happens by expanding the narrative, by gradually integrating those alternative stories until they become substantial enough to exist alongside the original one. Not, I stopped being who I was, but I discovered that I'm also someone to whom peace can belong. There is one point that needs to be stated clearly before anything else. An identity organized around hardship is not a failure. It is an achievement, a system that learned to function well under pressure, to navigate instability, to find resources when resources seemed scarce. That system developed something real abilities, a real way of being present, a relationship with its own capabilities that systems which have never truly been tested simply do not have. The problem is not that an identity built through hardship is wrong. It is that it remained incomplete. It stopped before making room for peace as something that is also possible, also belongs, and is also part of what this system is capable of becoming. And that incompleteness is not a character flaw. It is the natural outcome of a life story that contained enough chapters about struggle and very few chapters about what remains once the struggle is over. Swann's self-verification theory shows that the system resists information that contradicts its existing self-concept, but it also demonstrates that this resistance is not absolute. When information that conflicts with the self-concept arrives gradually enough, repeatedly enough, and within the right context, when evidence that peace is possible for this particular system accumulates in a way that can no longer be dismissed, the self-concept begins to expand. It is not replaced. It expands. The person who once saw themselves as someone who faces hardship does not have to stop being that person in order to also become someone to whom peace belongs. But that expansion has one essential condition, which Michael White described with remarkable precision. It does not happen through conviction. It happens through witnessing. The system needs experiences, real experiences, lived experiences, embodied experiences of peace that truly belongs. Not peace that is merely tolerated while waiting for the next crisis. Not peace observed from a distance as something that exists for other people, but peace that is actually inhabited, even briefly, even imperfectly, as something that also belongs to this system. Each of those experiences, when they are noticed instead of dismissed, contributes to what White called the thickening of the alternative story. The narrative that says, peace also belongs to me, gradually gains more examples, more weight, more presence within the system's landscape of possibilities. And with enough time and enough attention to those alternative stories, peace begins to feel less like foreign territory and more like a place the system recognizes, even if it is not the place where it has spent most of its life. This is neither simple nor quick, because decades of a dominant story are not rewritten through a decision. They are expanded through experience, and especially through experience that is consciously acknowledged. I was at peace just now. That is also part of who I am. I didn't need a crisis in order to exist fully in that moment. That is also possible. These are not positive affirmations in the superficial sense of the term. They are acts of witnessing, the system deliberately recording that the alternative story is becoming real. Subscribe to follow what comes next on this channel. The next video takes this conversation somewhere you'll recognize immediately. William Swann's self-verification theory, developed through decades of research at the University of Texas, proposes that people seek information that is consistent with their existing self-concept, not simply information that is positive. Internal coherence is prioritized over positivity. When the self-concept includes beliefs such as, I'm someone whose life is difficult, or I'm not someone who stays at peace for very long, the system treats experiences of peace as incompatible information and tends to resist, minimize, or dismiss them as exceptions that do not change the core narrative. The concept of flow, researched by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi at the University of Chicago and later at Claremont Graduate University, describes a state of complete engagement in challenges that stretch one's abilities to their limit. His work showed that these are often the moments when people experience the clearest and most coherent sense of themselves. For systems that spent enough years facing hardship, challenge became the landscape most closely associated with a vivid sense of self. Peace, by contrast, may be experienced as a reduction of the self, not as an achievement, but as an absence of meaning or agency. Narrative therapy, developed by Michael White and David Epstein, proposes that identity is organized through stories, particularly through dominant stories that filter experience, amplify compatible events, and dismiss incompatible ones. A dominant story centered on hardship treats moments of peace as exceptions that do not belong to the main narrative. Change does not happen by abandoning the dominant story, but by expanding it through what White called the thickening of alternative stories. The gradual integration of evidence that peace also belongs to the self. Social identity theory, developed by Henry Tajfel and John Turner, shows that part of identity is constructed through contrast with groups we do not see ourselves as belonging to. An identity organized around "I'm someone who deals with hardship" implicitly contrasts itself with the people for whom peace comes naturally, placing peace within the identity of another group. When genuine peace finally arrives, the system may experience something deeper than discomfort, confusion about which group it now belongs to, and what that says about the person it has been until now. If any part of this video describes something you recognized, that particular feeling of being at peace while sensing that the peace doesn't fully belong to you, leave a comment, just one word, whatever stayed with you. Because putting a name to that experience is already the beginning of a different relationship with what once seemed to be nothing more than the way life is. There is something, however, that this video touched on without fully opening. Because we've been talking about identity, about what the system believes about itself, an identity can expand, stories can grow, the self-concept can, with enough time and enough evidence, make room for peace. But there is a level deeper than identity, a level that does not respond to stories, self-concepts, or revised narratives. It is the level of the nervous system itself, and it has a characteristic that is both remarkably simple to describe and profoundly unsettling to experience. You can know, with complete rational certainty, that you are safe. You can have the right narrative. You can have expanded your self-concept. You can have, in every visible sense, solved the psychological problem. And yet, the body remains on alert. It continues signaling danger where no danger exists. It continues generating the physiology of threat in an objectively safe environment, not as drama, but as a persistent background state that does not disappear simply because the mind has changed its conclusion. Why is there a gap between knowing that you're safe and actually feeling safe? And what does the nervous system need, beyond the right words, beyond the correct understanding, to finally register that the danger has passed? There is one piece of this map that this channel has not yet fully explored, and that's where the next video begins. Don't miss it.